The dust kicked up in amber clouds as Rebecca Vance stood outside the general store in Fort Bowie, Arizona, watching the afternoon stage roll down the main street, and she wondered if the hollow feeling in her chest would ever go away before her wedding day arrived. It was June of 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on this frontier town perched on the edge of Apache territory, turning everything golden and hazy in the afternoon light. She adjusted the basket on her arm, filled with fabric she had just purchased for her wedding dress, and tried to summon some enthusiasm for the life she was about to begin. Her engagement to Martin Sutherland had been arranged 6 months ago, a practical union that made sense to everyone in Fort Bowie. Martin owned the largest ranch within 50 miles, employed half the men in town, and had the kind of steady, dependable nature that made him an ideal husband in the eyes of her father. At 22, Rebecca knew she should feel grateful for such a match. Martin was 35, respected, wealthy, and had promised her a comfortable life. He was not unkind, merely distant, treating their impending marriage like a business arrangement that required his signature. Rebecca had tried to love him. She had tried to feel something beyond polite regard when he came to call at her father's small ranch, sitting stiffly in the parlor while discussing cattle prices and water rights. But there was no spark, no flutter in her heart, no warmth spreading through her chest when he took her hand. Her mother had died 3 years ago, taking with her any hope Rebecca had of discussing such complicated feelings. Her father, Samuel Vance, was a good man but practical to his core. Love, he had told her, was a luxury frontier women could not always afford. The wedding was set for 3 weeks from today, and Rebecca felt as though she were walking toward the edge of a cliff with her eyes wide open. She was about to cross the street when she heard it, the thundering of hooves that made several people stop and turn. A lone rider came tearing into town, his horse lathered and breathing hard, clearly having been pushed to its limits. The man sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the sun, and even from a distance, Rebecca could see the easy confidence in the way he moved with his horse, as though they were one entity rather than 2 separate beings. He slowed as he entered the main street, bringing his mount down to a trot, and that was when Rebecca saw his face. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His jaw was strong and shadowed with several days of stubble, and when he turned his head, scanning the town with alert brown eyes, those eyes landed directly on her. The moment stretched impossibly long. Rebecca felt her breath catch in her throat, felt something electric and unfamiliar shoot straight through her core. The stranger's gaze held hers for 3 heartbeats, 4, and she saw his expression shift from casual observation to something intense and searching. Then someone called out to him, breaking the spell, and he turned his attention to the man approaching him. Rebecca realized she was standing frozen in the middle of the boardwalk, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She forced herself to move, to walk toward her father's wagon parked outside the mercantile, but her hands were trembling as she placed the basket in the back. "You all right, Miss Vance?" She turned to find Thomas Garrett, one of her father's ranch hands, looking at her with concern. He had been waiting to help load her purchases. "Fine, Thomas. Just the heat," she lied, fanning herself with her hand, but it was not the heat and she knew it. In the span of a single glance, something fundamental had shifted in her world. She did not even know the stranger's name, yet every nerve in her body was screaming at her to turn around, to look at him again, to understand what had just passed between them. She did not turn around. Instead, she climbed into the wagon and waited for Thomas to finish loading her supplies, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on her hands folded in her lap. When Thomas finally snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, Rebecca allowed herself one glance back. The stranger was standing outside the saloon, his horse tied to the rail, and he was watching her leave. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze, and her traitorous heart leaped in response. The 5-mile ride back to her father's ranch passed in a blur. Thomas tried to make conversation about the upcoming 4th of July celebration, but Rebecca barely heard him, offering vague responses while her mind spun in confused circles. She was engaged. She had given her word. In 3 weeks, she would be Mrs. Martin Sutherland, mistress of the largest ranch in the territory, and she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for her good fortune. So why did it feel like she had just left part of herself back in Fort Bowie? Her father was in the barn when they arrived, working on repairing a broken stall door. Samuel Vance was 58 years old, weathered by years of frontier life, but still strong and capable. He looked up when Rebecca entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Get everything you needed?" he asked, wiping his hands on his pants. "Yes, Papa. Mrs. Chen had some beautiful cream-colored cotton that will work perfectly for the dress." Samuel's smile widened. "Your mother would have been so happy to see you married, Rebecca. Martin is a good man. He will take care of you." Rebecca felt something twist in her chest. "I know, Papa. You do not sound convinced." Her father set down his hammer and regarded her with shrewd eyes that missed very little. "I am just nervous, that is all. Every bride gets nervous." "Your mother was terrified on our wedding day," Samuel said softly, his voice taking on the gentle tone it always did when he spoke of his late wife. "She told me later she almost ran away, but we had 30 good years together, Rebecca. Love does not always come in a lightning strike. Sometimes it grows slow and steady, like a good crop." Rebecca nodded, not trusting herself to speak. But the problem was, she had just experienced exactly what her father was describing, a lightning strike, a moment of pure electric connection with a complete stranger. And now she knew what she would be missing when she married Martin Sutherland. That evening, she sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of crimson and gold. The desert stretched out before her, dotted with sagebrush and the distant shapes of mesas against the horizon. This land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. She had lived here her whole life, had never traveled further than Tucson, and sometimes she wondered what lay beyond the mountains, what other lives she might have lived if circumstances had been different. She wondered where the stranger was right now. Was he staying in Fort Bowie? Was he just passing through? Would she ever see him again? The thought that she might not made her feel hollow inside. The next day was Sunday, which meant church in town and dinner afterward at Martin's ranch. Rebecca dressed carefully in her best Sunday dress, a sage green calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her auburn hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Her father drove them to town in the wagon, talking about needing to hire more hands for the summer work, and Rebecca made appropriate noises of agreement while her stomach twisted itself into knots. Fort Bowie's small church was already filling up when they arrived. Rebecca followed her father inside, her eyes automatically scanning the crowd before she could stop herself. She did not see the stranger. She did see Martin, sitting in his usual pew near the front, and he turned and nodded at her formally when she entered. Rebecca slid into the pew beside him, and he gave her hand a brief, perfunctory pat. "Good morning, Rebecca. You look well." "Thank you, Martin, as do you." It was the same exchange they had every Sunday, pleasant and meaningless. Martin turned his attention back to Reverend Walsh, who was preparing to begin the service, and Rebecca tried to focus on the hymnal in her hands. She made it through the first hymn, and the opening prayer before the door at the back of the church creaked open. Rebecca, seated in the middle of the church, turned slightly along with several other curious parishioners. The stranger stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his tall frame backlit by the morning sun. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaved, his dark hair combed back, wearing clean trousers and a pressed white shirt. His eyes scanned the room, and once again they found Rebecca with unerring accuracy. This time, she could not look away. She watched as something flickered in his expression, watched his gaze drop to Martin sitting beside her, to Martin's hand resting possessively on the pew back behind her shoulders. She watched the stranger's jaw tighten, watched him give the slightest nod of acknowledgement before he moved to take a seat in the back row. Rebecca faced forward, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone around her could hear it. Beside her, Martin seemed oblivious, his attention on Reverend Walsh's sermon about duty and commitment. The irony was not lost on Rebecca. She did not hear a word of the service. Every particle of her awareness was focused on the presence in the back of the church, on the weight of eyes she could feel on her shoulders. When the congregation stood for the final hymn, she could not resist glancing back. The stranger was singing, his voice a rich baritone that carried across the small space, and his eyes were locked on her face. The hymn was about grace and salvation, about finding light in darkness, and Rebecca felt the words resonate in her bones in a way they never had before. When the service ended, Martin placed his hand on the small of Rebecca's back, guiding her toward the door where Reverend Walsh stood greeting his parishioners. Rebecca moved as though in a dream, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, while her peripheral vision tracked the stranger as he made his way through the crowd. They reached the church steps at the same time. "Miss Vance," Reverend Walsh said warmly, clasping her hand. "How are the wedding preparations coming along?" "Very well, thank you, Reverend." "Martin, you are a fortunate man," the Reverend continued, beaming at her fiancé. "I am well aware," Martin said, his tone suggesting he was already thinking about other matters. "Reverend Walsh." The voice came from behind them, deep and warm with a slight roughness that sent shivers down Rebecca's spine. They all turned to find the stranger standing there, still holding his hat, his brown eyes polite but intense. "Welcome, son," the Reverend said. "I do not believe we have met." "Elijah Barnes," the stranger said, extending his hand. "I just arrived in Fort Bowie yesterday. I will be working at the Copper Ridge Mine." "Wonderful, wonderful. Always glad to have new members of our community. Let me introduce you to some folks. This is Martin Sutherland, who owns the largest ranch in the territory, and his fiancée, Miss Rebecca Vance." Rebecca felt the world tilt slightly as Elijah Barnes turned his attention fully to her. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. "Miss Vance," he said softly, and extended his hand. Rebecca placed her hand in his, and the contact sent sparks racing up her arm. His hand was warm and calloused, strong but gentle, and he held her fingers a fraction of a second longer than propriety dictated. "Mr. Barnes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "pleasure to meet you." His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw questions, longing, and something that looked like regret. Then Martin was clearing his throat, and Rebecca withdrew her hand, and the moment shattered. "Barnes," Martin said, his tone dismissive. "The mine is hard work. Hope you are prepared for it." "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Sutherland." There was an edge to Elijah's voice, something that made Martin's eyes narrow slightly. For a long moment, The two men regarded each other with the kind of assessment males had been giving each other since the dawn of time, sizing up potential rivals. "Come along, Rebecca," Martin said, placing his hand on her elbow. "We do not want to keep the cook waiting." Rebecca allowed herself to be led away, but she could feel Elijah's gaze following her down the church steps and across the dusty street to where Martin's elegant carriage waited. She climbed inside, her hands shaking, and did not look back. Sunday dinner at Martin's ranch was always an elaborate affair. His home was the finest in the territory, a sprawling adobe structure with real glass windows and furnishings imported from back east. His cook, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, prepared meals that would not have been out of place in a San Francisco hotel. Martin took great pride in his home, often pointing out various acquisitions and their value. Today, Rebecca sat at the long dining table and pushed roasted chicken around her plate, barely tasting anything. Martin discussed some trouble he was having with rustlers, and Rebecca's father offered suggestions, but she could not focus on the conversation. Her mind kept returning to the church steps, to the feeling of Elijah Barnes's hand holding hers, to the way he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the world who mattered. "Rebecca, are you feeling well?" Martin asked, and she realized both men were looking at her expectantly. "I apologize. I think the heat is affecting me." "You should rest more," Martin said, his tone practical rather than concerned. "You have been working too hard on the wedding preparations. Once we are married, you will not need to exert yourself so much. I have staff to handle such matters." Rebecca nodded, understanding the unspoken message. As Martin's wife, she would be ornamental, a symbol of his success and status. She would manage his household, entertain his business associates, and produce his heirs. She would be comfortable, secure, and utterly unnecessary. The thought had never bothered her before. Now it felt suffocating. After dinner, Martin walked her and her father to their wagon. He kissed Rebecca's hand formally, his lips barely brushing her knuckles, and helped her into her seat. "I will call on you Wednesday evening," he said. "We need to finalize the guest list." "Of course." Rebecca watched him return to his grand house, his posture perfect, his steps measured and controlled. Everything about Martin Sutherland was controlled, ordered, planned. There was no room for spontaneity, for passion, for the kind of wild abandon that made hearts race and breath catch. On the ride home, her father was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "That fellow at church today, the one named Barnes, he could not take his eyes off you." Rebecca's heart skipped. "I had not noticed, Rebecca." Her father's voice was gentle but firm. "I was not born yesterday, and neither were you." She turned to look at him, this man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride and shoot and read the weather in the clouds. His weathered face was kind but serious. "Papa, you gave your word to Martin," Samuel said quietly. "Your word means something in this world, Rebecca. It is all we really have out here, our word and our reputation." "I know," but her father continued, and she looked at him in surprise. "I also know I pushed you toward this engagement. I thought I was doing right by you, setting you up with security and comfort. Your mother, though, she would have asked if you were happy, and I realize I never did." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. "Papa, are you happy, Rebecca?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. The honest answer would break her father's heart, would confirm that he had failed her, would unravel all the careful plans that had been made. But looking into his eyes, she could not lie. "I do not know," she whispered. "I thought I could be content. I thought that would be enough." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, the reins loose in his weathered hands as the horses plodded along the familiar road home. "Your mother and I, we chose each other. Against her parents' wishes, actually." She was supposed to marry a banker's son in Philadelphia. Instead, she ran off with a wild-eyed farmer who wanted to make his fortune in Arizona territory. Rebecca stared at her father. She had never heard this story. "We had nothing when we started," Samuel continued, a slight smile touching his lips. "Lived in a tent the first year while I built our first cabin. She washed clothes for miners to help us get by. It was hard, Rebecca. Harder than you can imagine. But we had each other, and that made all the difference. Every morning I woke up grateful that she had chosen me, and I really hope she felt the same way. She did, Papa, I know she did. I want that for you, daughter. I want you to wake up grateful every morning. I want you to choose your own path, even if it is a harder one." Rebecca's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. "But what about your arrangement with Martin? What about the agreements you made?" "Let me worry about Martin Sutherland," her father said firmly. "You worry about what your heart is telling you." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with possibility rather than resignation. When they reached the ranch, Rebecca hugged her father tightly before heading inside. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the coyotes howling in the distance, thinking about choices and consequences, and the terrifying freedom her father had just given her. Breaking her engagement to Martin would cause a scandal. It would hurt her father's standing in the community. Martin would be furious, possibly vindictive. But somewhere in Fort Bowie, there was a man named Elijah Barnes who had looked at her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was something worth fighting for. She did not know anything about him beyond his name and the fact that he worked at the mine. She did not know if what she felt was real or just a desperate fantasy, an escape from a future that felt like a cage. She only knew that she could not marry Martin Sutherland without at least understanding what she was giving up. The next morning, Rebecca made a decision. She saddled her horse, a gentle mare named Stella, and told her father she was riding into town to pick up some embroidery thread. It was not entirely a lie. She did need thread. She also needed answers. Fort Bowie was quiet on Monday mornings. Most of the men were at work, either at the mine or on the various ranches. Rebecca tied Stella outside the mercantile and went inside, her heart hammering. Mrs. Chen, the shop owner, greeted her warmly and helped her select thread for her needlework. Rebecca made small talk, trying to work up the courage to ask the questions burning in her mind. Finally, as Mrs. Chen was wrapping her purchases, Rebecca forced herself to speak. "That new man at church yesterday, Mr. Barnes. Has he been in the store?" Mrs. Chen's eyes sparkled with interest. "Oh yes, he came in Saturday evening to buy some supplies. Very polite young man. He is from Colorado originally, came here because his brother is one of the foremen at the Copper Ridge mine." Rebecca absorbed this information, filing it away. "Is he staying in town?" "I believe he is renting a room at Mrs. Murphy's boarding house." Mrs. Chen gave Rebecca a knowing look. "Why do you ask, dear? You are engaged to Mr. Sutherland, are you not?" Rebecca felt her cheeks flush. "Of course. I was just making conversation." But Mrs. Chen's expression suggested she did not believe that for a moment, and Rebecca fled the store before she could embarrass herself further. She stood on the boardwalk, clutching her package, trying to decide what to do next. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house was just down the street. Rebecca could see it from where she stood, a neat two-story building with a wide front porch. What would she even say if she went there? What possible excuse could she have for calling on a single man she barely knew, Miss Vance? Rebecca spun around, and there he was. Elijah Barnes stood a few feet away, dressed in work clothes, his face already dusty from the mine. He must have come into town during the lunch break. His brown eyes were warm but cautious, as though he was afraid she might run away. "Mr. Barnes," she managed. They stood there for a long moment, the busy street moving around them, neither quite knowing what to say. Finally, Elijah cleared his throat. "I was about to get some lunch at the cafe. Would you care to join me?" It was a bold invitation, possibly improper, definitely risky. Rebecca knew she should decline, should make an excuse and leave before anyone saw them together and started gossiping. But her father's words echoed in her mind. "Choose your own path." "Yes," she said, "I would like that." His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish in his pleasure. "I am glad." They walked to the small cafe at the end of the street, a modest establishment run by a widow named Sarah Miller. Rebecca was acutely aware of the eyes following them, of the whispers that would surely start before they even sat down. But for once, she did not care. Sarah Miller raised an eyebrow when they entered together, but said nothing, simply showed them to a small table near the window and took their order for coffee and sandwiches. Once they were alone, Elijah leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. "I need to be honest with you, Miss Vance. I have been hoping for a chance to speak with you since I first saw you on Saturday." Rebecca's heart fluttered. "Why?" "Because," he said simply, "I have never believed in fate or destiny or any of that romantic nonsense until I looked at you. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life changed." The raw honesty in his voice stole her breath. "I am engaged, Mr. Barnes. I know. And if you tell me you love him, if you tell me you are happy with your choice, I will walk away right now and never bother you again. I promise you that." Rebecca looked down at her hands, at the bare finger where Martin's ring would soon rest. He had not actually given her a ring yet, said he was having one specially made in San Francisco. Another part of their engagement that felt more like a business transaction than a romance. "I cannot tell you that," she whispered. When she looked up, Elijah's eyes were blazing with an emotion so intense it made her shiver. "Then tell me I have a chance. Tell me I am not crazy for feeling like I have been waiting my whole life to meet you." "You are not crazy," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "I feel it too, but I do not understand it. We do not even know each other." "Then let me fix that." Elijah reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Let me court you properly. Let me show you who I am. And then, if you still choose him, I will accept it. But Rebecca, please, give me a chance." The use of her first name sent warmth flooding through her. She should object, should insist on formality, but she found she loved the sound of her name on his lips. "Tell me about yourself," she said instead. And he did. Over coffee and sandwiches that Rebecca barely tasted, Elijah Barnes told her his story. He was 27 years old, originally from a small town in Colorado. His family had been farmers, but a drought had destroyed their crops 3 years running, forcing them to sell their land. His parents had moved to live with his sister in Denver, but Elijah and his younger brother Daniel had headed south, looking for new opportunities. Daniel had found work as a foreman at the Copper Ridge mine and had written to Elijah about openings. "I have been working in mines for 2 years now," Elijah said. "It is hard work, dangerous sometimes, but honest. I have been saving money, hoping to buy my own piece of land someday. Nothing fancy, just a small ranch where I can raise horses. That has always been my dream." "Why horses?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. Elijah's face softened. "My grandfather raised horses. Some of my earliest memories are of being in the barn with him, watching him work with the young colts. He had this way with them, gentle but firm, and they trusted him completely. He used to say that a good horse was a better friend than most men, and I have found that to be true more often than not." Rebecca smiled. My father has a similar philosophy about his cattle dog." They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily, naturally. Rebecca told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's death, about her love of reading and her secret dream of seeing the ocean someday. Elijah listened intently, asking questions, remembering details, treating everything she said as though it mattered. It was so different from conversations with Martin, where she always felt like a pleasant backdrop to his monologues about his own achievements. Finally, Rebecca glanced at the small clock on the cafe wall and realized with a start how long they had been sitting there. "I need to get home. My father will wonder where I am." Elijah stood immediately, helping her with her chair like a gentleman. "May I walk you to your horse?" "Yes." Outside, the afternoon sun was brutal, but Rebecca barely noticed. Elijah walked beside her, close enough that their arms almost touched, and she was hyper-aware of every breath, every step. At Stella's side, they stopped. Elijah ran a hand along the mare's neck, and Stella nickered softly, clearly approving of him. "She likes you," Rebecca said. "I have always gotten along with horses better than people." Elijah turned to face her fully. "Rebecca, I know this is complicated. I know I am asking you to risk a lot. But I need you to know I am serious about you. This is not some passing fancy or a game to me." "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Everything," he said simply. "Your time, your trust, your heart. I want to know what makes you laugh, what makes you cry, what you dream about when you cannot sleep. I want to be the man who makes you happy, who protects you, who builds a life with you. I know it is too soon to say these things. I know I sound like a madman, but I also know that chances like this do not come along often. And I would regret it for the rest of my life if I did not fight for you." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw emotion and honesty. "Elijah, you do not have to say anything right now," he interrupted gently. "Just think about it. Think about what you want, not what everyone else expects from you. And if you decide you want to see me again, I will be here." He helped her mount Stella, his hands steady on her waist, and Rebecca looked down at him from the saddle. In the bright Arizona sunlight, his brown eyes were flecked with gold, and she wanted nothing more than to climb back down and throw her arms around him. Instead, she gathered her reins and gave him a small smile. "Thank you for lunch, Elijah." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Rebecca." She rode away, but she could feel his gaze following her until she turned the corner and Fort Bowie disappeared behind her. The ride home took forever, and no time at all. Rebecca's mind was spinning, her heart full of a wild joy that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. She had just had lunch with another man while engaged to Martin Sutherland. She had allowed that man to call her by her first name, to speak to her of courtship and futures and dreams. She had, in effect, betrayed every expectation placed upon her, and she had never felt more alive. Her father was mending fence when she arrived home. He looked up as she dismounted, his expression unreadable. "How was town?" he asked casually. "Eventful," Rebecca admitted. Samuel set down his tools and walked over to her. "Want to talk about it?" And so she told him everything, the words spilling out in a rush. She told him about the cafe, about Elijah's honesty, about the way she felt when she was with him. Her father listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. When she finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "You are going to have to make a choice, Rebecca, and soon. Martin is not a patient man, and he will not take kindly to being made a fool of." "I know, Papa. But," her father continued, his voice gentle, "I trust you to make the right choice for yourself. Whatever you decide, I will support you." Rebecca hugged him tightly, grateful beyond words for his understanding. That evening, she sat at her mother's old writing desk, and tried to compose a letter to Martin. She wrote 3 different versions, each one attempting to explain feelings she did not fully understand herself. Finally, she gave up and went to bed, no closer to a decision than she had been that morning. The next day passed in a blur of chores and anxious thoughts. Rebecca cleaned the house, worked in the garden, mended clothes, all while her mind obsessed over Elijah Barnes. She replayed their conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, every moment. On Wednesday, Martin came to call as promised. He arrived in his elegant carriage, dressed impeccably as always, carrying a leather folder containing the guest list for their wedding. Rebecca received him in the parlor, her stomach churning with guilt and confusion. "You look tired, Rebecca," Martin observed, settling into the best chair. "Are you not sleeping well?" "The heat has been difficult," she lied. "Once we are married, you will have better accommodations. My home is much cooler than this place, built with proper ventilation." Rebecca bristled slightly at the implied criticism of her father's home but said nothing. Martin opened his folder and began reviewing the guest list, his voice droning on about various business associates who must be invited, family members who would be offended if excluded, political considerations that required certain invitations. Rebecca tried to pay attention, tried to care about seating arrangements and menu choices, but her mind kept drifting to a dusty man with kind eyes who talked about dreams and horses and futures built on hope rather than calculation. "Rebecca, are you listening to me?" She jerked her attention back to Martin. "I apologize. What were you saying?" Martin's eyes narrowed. "I was saying that I have arranged for a photographer to come from Tucson for the wedding. It will cost a considerable sum, but I want proper documentation of the event." "That sounds lovely." "You have been distracted all week," Martin said, his tone shifting to something harder. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Rebecca's heart hammered. This was her chance, the moment to be honest, to explain that she was not certain she could marry him. But looking at Martin's cold, assessing eyes, she could not find the words. "I am just overwhelmed with all the preparations," she said instead, and hated herself for the cowardice. Martin seemed to accept this. He spent another hour going over details, treating their wedding like a military campaign that required precise planning and execution. When he finally left, pressing a dry kiss to her forehead, Rebecca felt exhausted and more confused than ever. Her father had made himself scarce during Martin's visit, but he emerged from the barn once the carriage had disappeared down the road. "You did not tell him," Samuel observed. "I do not know what to tell him, Papa. I barely know Elijah. What if this is just infatuation? What if I throw away a secure future for something that burns out in a month?" "That is a fair question," her father said. "But let me ask you this. When you imagine your life a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, which future makes you happy? The one with Martin or the one with Elijah?" Rebecca closed her eyes, and the answer came to her with painful clarity. In her imagination, she could see herself in Martin's grand house, attending his dinner parties, managing his staff, smiling politely while dying inside. And she could see another version, harder perhaps, less certain but full of laughter and passion and genuine connection. "I need to see Elijah again," she said quietly. "Then go see him." "Papa, I cannot just—" "Rebecca, you are a grown woman. You can ride into town whenever you please. Stop making excuses and go get what you want." His bluntness startled a laugh out of her. "When did you become so progressive?" "When I realized my daughter was about to make the same mistake her mother almost made, choosing security over happiness. I got lucky that your mother came to her senses before it was too late. I want you to have that same chance." The next morning, Rebecca rode into Fort Bowie with purpose. She had dressed carefully in her best riding outfit, a practical split skirt and white blouse, and had taken extra care with her hair. She knew what she was doing was scandalous, knew that by now half the town was probably gossiping about her lunch with Elijah, but she was beyond caring. She found him at the mine. The Copper Ridge operation was about 2 miles outside of town, a sprawling complex of buildings and excavations carved into the rocky hillside. Rebecca had never been here before, and the noise and activity were overwhelming. Men shouted to each other over the sound of machinery. Ore carts rattled along metal tracks, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. She asked one of the workers where she could find Elijah Barnes, and the man pointed her toward a smaller building that served as the foreman's office. Rebecca tied Stella to a post and walked inside, her heart pounding. Elijah was there, bent over a table studying what looked like engineering drawings. He was talking with another man, older and bearing a strong resemblance to him. When the door opened, both men looked up and Elijah's face transformed when he saw her. "Rebecca," he said, and there was such joy in his voice that it made her smile. "I am sorry to interrupt your work," she said. I wanted to see you." The older man cleared his throat and Elijah seemed to remember his presence. "Rebecca, this is my brother Daniel. Daniel, this is Miss Rebecca Vance." Daniel Barnes gave her a knowing look and a warm smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Vance. Elijah has mentioned you." "Has he?" Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "Once or twice," Daniel said dryly. "Or possibly every hour since Sunday. I will leave you two alone. I need to check on the south shaft anyway." He tipped his hat to Rebecca and left, and then she and Elijah were alone in the dusty office. Elijah crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. "You came," he said softly. "I could not stay away." "I am glad. I have been going crazy, hoping you would want to see me again, but not knowing if you would." Rebecca looked up at him, at this man who made her feel things she had never experienced before. "Elijah, I need to be honest with you. I am supposed to marry Martin in less than 3 weeks. My father supports whatever decision I make, but breaking the engagement will cause problems. Martin is powerful and vindictive, and he does not take well to being crossed." "I know all that," Elijah said, "and I am still here. I am still asking for a chance." "Why?" Rebecca asked desperately. "Why are you willing to risk all this for someone you barely know?" Elijah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hand. "Because the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you." I know it sounds crazy. I know it does not make logical sense, but Rebecca, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are worth fighting for. You are worth risking everything for. Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks, and Elijah's thumb gently wiped them away. "I am so scared," she whispered. "I know, but you do not have to be scared alone. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, I will be here." Rebecca made a decision. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, a soft, tentative press of lips that quickly deepened into something more. Elijah's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Rebecca felt like she had finally come home. The kiss was everything she had been missing, all the passion and connection and rightness that had been absent from her relationship with Martin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Rebecca Vance, you are going to be the death of me." "Is that a complaint?" "Not even remotely." They spent the next hour talking, making plans. Elijah explained that he could not leave the mine during working hours, but his evenings were free. Rebecca suggested they meet outside of town, somewhere they could talk without the entire population of Fort Bowie watching and gossiping. Elijah knew a spot, a small canyon with a spring about halfway between town and her father's ranch, accessible by horseback. "Meet me there tomorrow evening," Elijah said. "Around sunset. We can talk properly without interruption." "I will be there." Rebecca rode home feeling like she was floating. The decision was made, though she had not yet spoken the words aloud. She could not marry Martin Sutherland. She could not spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been with Elijah Barnes. That evening, she sat at her mother's desk again and finally wrote the letter she had been avoiding. It was brief and to the point. She explained that she could not marry him, that she was sorry for any embarrassment or inconvenience this would cause, but that she could not in good conscience enter into a marriage without love. She did not mention Elijah. This was about more than just another man. This was about choosing herself, choosing happiness, choosing a life worth living. She sealed the letter and set it on her dresser. She would deliver it tomorrow after she met with Elijah. She wanted one perfect evening before the storm hit. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Rebecca did her chores, helped her father with the accounts, and tried not to watch the sun's progress across the sky. Finally, as the afternoon began to fade into evening, she told her father she was going riding. Samuel looked up from his newspaper and gave her a knowing smile. "Be careful." "I will, Papa." "I mean it, Rebecca, and not just about the riding." Rebecca kissed his weathered cheek. "I know." She saddled Stella and rode out, following Elijah's directions to the canyon. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all red rock and sage, the mountains purple in the distance. As she rode, Rebecca felt a sense of freedom and possibility she had never experienced before. Whatever happened next, she was choosing her own path. The canyon was exactly where Elijah had described it, a narrow cut in the rock that opened into a small oasis. A spring bubbled up from the ground, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. It was cooler here, sheltered from the brutal sun, and the sound of water was soothing. Elijah was already there, sitting on a flat rock near the pool. He had changed out of his work clothes into clean trousers and a blue shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. He stood when he saw her, his face lighting up with that smile that made her heart race. "You found it," he said, helping her dismount. "Your directions were perfect." They stood there for a moment, suddenly awkward now that they were alone in this isolated place. Then Elijah took her hand, and the awkwardness melted away. "Come sit with me," he said, leading her to the flat rock. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. "I wrote to Martin today," Rebecca said quietly, "breaking the engagement." Elijah turned to look at her, his eyes searching. "Are you certain?" "Rebecca, I do not want you to have regrets." "I am certain," she said firmly. "Even if you and I do not work out, even if this is all a beautiful mistake, I cannot marry Martin. I cannot settle for a life without passion, without love. You helped me see that, Elijah. You showed me what I was missing." Elijah pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I promise you, Rebecca, I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I do not have much to offer right now, just hard work and big dreams, but I will build us a life worth living. I swear it." Rebecca pulled back to look at him. "Tell me about your dreams. Tell me what you see for our future." And so he did. Elijah painted a picture with his words of a small ranch in the foothills, a modest house they would build together, a barn full of horses they would raise and train. He talked about children playing in the yard, about Sunday dinners and shared work and growing old together. He spoke of hardship too, of the reality of frontier life, of the struggles they would face. But through it all, his love and commitment shone clear. This was not a fantasy. This was a plan, a vision of a real life they could build together if they were brave enough to try. "When can we get married?" Rebecca asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Elijah laughed, pure joy in the sound. "As soon as you want, tomorrow if you will have me. I need to deliver the letter to Martin first, and deal with the fallout. But then, yes, soon. I do not want to wait, Elijah. I have wasted enough time on a future that was never right for me." They talked until the stars came out, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Elijah told her about his childhood, about losing the farm, about the guilt he sometimes felt for not being able to save his parents' legacy. Rebecca told him about her mother's death, about the loneliness that had driven her to accept Martin's proposal in the first place. When she finally rode home, long after full dark, her heart was full and her mind was made up. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Elijah by her side. The next morning, Rebecca dressed carefully in a severe gray dress that seemed appropriate for the difficult task ahead. She tucked Martin's letter into her pocket and rode into town, her stomach churning with anxiety but her resolve firm. Martin's ranch house loomed large and imposing as she approached. A servant took Stella's reins, and Rebecca was shown into the parlor to wait. She stood by the window, the letter burning in her pocket, rehearsing what she would say. Martin entered a few minutes later, his expression mildly surprised. "Rebecca, I was not expecting you today. Is something wrong?" "I need to speak with you, Martin. It is important." Something in her tone must have alerted him because his expression shifted, becoming wary. "Very well. Sit down." "I would rather stand." Now he looked truly concerned. "Rebecca, what is this about?" She pulled the letter from her pocket with shaking hands. "Martin, I am sorry. I should have been honest with you weeks ago, but I was not brave enough. I cannot marry you. I do not love you, and I never will. You deserve someone who can be a true partner to you, and that person is not me." The silence that followed was terrible. Martin's face went through several expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, before finally settling on a cold fury that made Rebecca take an involuntary step back. "This is about that miner, is it not?" His voice was deadly quiet. "That Barnes fellow. I have heard the gossip, Rebecca. The whole town is talking about you throwing yourself at him." Rebecca's chin came up. "This is about me choosing my own life, Martin. Yes, I have feelings for Elijah, but even if I did not, I still could not marry you. We do not suit each other. You know this as well as I do." "What I know," Martin said, his voice rising, "is that you have made a fool of me. Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation? To my standing in this community? Your reputation will survive, Martin. You are wealthy and powerful. You will find another wife easily." "I do not want another wife," he snarled. "I want the one I chose. We had an agreement, Rebecca. Your father gave me his word, and he has released me from that promise. I am sorry, Martin, but my decision is final." Martin crossed the room so quickly that Rebecca flinched, but he stopped just short of touching her. His face was mottled with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are making a terrible mistake. That Barnes fellow has nothing to offer you. Nothing. He is a laborer, a nobody. In a year, you will be living in poverty, regretting this foolish choice." "Then that will be my mistake to make," Rebecca said, proud that her voice did not shake. "Goodbye, Martin." She walked past him, her head held high, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Your father will suffer for this, Rebecca. I employ half the men in this territory. One word from me and he will find it very difficult to do business around here." Rebecca turned slowly, fury burning away her fear. "Are you threatening my father, Martin?" "I am stating a fact. Actions have consequences." "Then I suggest you think very carefully about those consequences," Rebecca said coldly. "Because if you harm my father in any way, I will make sure everyone in the territory knows exactly what kind of man you really are. Do you understand me?" They stared at each other for a long moment, and Rebecca saw the calculation in Martin's eyes. He was a businessman, used to weighing risks and benefits. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Get out of my house." Rebecca left, her legs shaking so badly she could barely mount Stella, but she had done it. She had ended her engagement, had stood up to Martin Sutherland, and had chosen her own path. The knowledge filled her with a fierce pride that carried her all the way back to town. She went straight to Mrs. Murphy's boarding house. The elderly landlady answered the door, her eyebrows rising when she saw Rebecca. "Miss Vance, what can I do for you? Is Elijah Barnes here?" Mrs. Murphy's expression became shrewd. "He left for the mine about an hour ago, dear, but I expect he will be back for lunch around noon." "May I wait for him?" "That would not be proper, Miss Vance, and you know it." But Mrs. Murphy's eyes were kind. "However, my parlor is visible from the street. If you wanted to sit there and read while you wait, I suppose there would be no harm in that." Rebecca smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy." The parlor was small but comfortable, and Rebecca pretended to read a magazine while watching the street through the window. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, just before noon, she saw Elijah striding down the street, his clothes dusty from the mine. Rebecca met him at the door before he could even enter. "Elijah." His face lit up when he saw her, but then he registered her expression. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I broke the engagement. I just came from Martin's ranch." Elijah pulled her into his arms right there on Mrs. Murphy's front porch, not caring who saw. "Was he terrible?" "He was angry. He threatened my father's business interests." Rebecca pulled back to look at him. "Elijah, are you certain about this? Martin could make things very difficult for us." "Let him try," Elijah said fiercely. "Rebecca, I told you. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I am not afraid of Martin Sutherland. We will build our own life, away from his influence if necessary." "He said you had nothing to offer me." "He is right about that," Elijah said honestly. "I do not have wealth or land or status. All I have is my 2 hands, my willingness to work, and my love for you. If that is not enough, I understand." Rebecca stood on her toes and kissed him, right there in broad daylight where anyone could see. "It is more than enough. It is everything." From that moment on, things moved quickly. Rebecca's father, true to his word, stood by her decision despite the social fallout. Martin, true to his threat, did make things difficult for a while. He spread rumors, used his influence to interfere with Samuel's business dealings, and made his displeasure known throughout Fort Bowie. But the town was not as unified in its condemnation as Martin had hoped. Many people, particularly the women, were quietly supportive of Rebecca's choice. They had seen the lack of warmth between her and Martin, had witnessed Elijah's obvious devotion, and romantic hearts won out over social convention. Elijah and Rebecca were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they had first met. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the grand affair Martin had planned. Reverend Walsh performed the service, with Daniel Barnes standing as best man and Mrs. Chen serving as Rebecca's attendant. Samuel walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes and gave her away with a smile. Rebecca wore the cream-colored dress she had made for her wedding to Martin, but she had altered it significantly, adding lace and embroidery that reflected her own taste rather than what she thought Martin would approve of. She had never felt more beautiful than when she saw the look in Elijah's eyes as she approached him at the altar. They spoke their vows with simple sincerity, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When Elijah kissed his bride, sealing their union, Rebecca felt tears of joy streaming down her face. The reception was held at Sarah Miller's cafe, a modest celebration with homemade food and genuine warmth. It was everything Rebecca's wedding to Martin would not have been, full of laughter and real affection instead of social posturing. That night, Elijah carried Rebecca over the threshold of their new home, a small but sturdy cabin he had rented on the outskirts of town. It was nothing compared to Martin's mansion, just 3 rooms with basic furnishings, but Rebecca had never been happier. This was theirs, a home they would build together. Elijah set her down gently in the middle of their bedroom, his eyes full of love and desire and just a touch of nervousness. "Mrs. Barnes," he said softly, testing out her new name. "Mr. Barnes," she replied, smiling up at him. "I love you, Rebecca. I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Elijah. Thank you for being brave enough to fight for me. Thank you for being brave enough to choose yourself." They came together then, husband and wife, sealing their marriage in the most intimate way possible. Rebecca had been nervous about this aspect of married life, but Elijah was gentle and patient, making sure she felt cherished and safe. Their joining was tender and passionate, a perfect expression of the love that had brought them together so quickly. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Rebecca's head on Elijah's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me about the ranch you want to build," she murmured sleepily. And Elijah did, his voice low and warm in the darkness, painting pictures of their future with his words. Rebecca drifted off to sleep listening to him describe the house they would build, the horses they would raise, the life they would create together. The next few months were a whirlwind of work and adjustment. Elijah continued at the mine, working long hours to save money for their future ranch. Rebecca took in sewing and helped Mrs. Chen at the mercantile a few days a week, adding her earnings to their savings. It was hard work, much harder than the life she would have had as Martin's wife, but Rebecca had never been happier. They spent their evenings together, cooking simple meals and talking about their days. Elijah taught Rebecca about horses, taking her to visit various ranches where he would assess stock, explaining what made a good animal worth investing in. Rebecca taught Elijah to read better than he had learned in his limited schooling, and they would spend hours with books borrowed from Reverend Walsh, expanding their knowledge together. Martin, as predicted, did not take his rejection well. He continued to cause problems where he could, but his influence was not as absolute as he thought. When he tried to pressure Samuel Vance by interfering with his cattle sales, several other ranchers stepped in to help, quietly undermining Martin's efforts. The frontier had its own code, and Martin's vindictiveness was not sitting well with many people. 4 months after the wedding, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Elijah, sitting at their small kitchen table after dinner, he stared at her in stunned silence for a long moment before breaking into the widest smile she had ever seen. "A baby," he breathed. "Rebecca, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, suddenly nervous. Happy does not begin to cover it. Elijah pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of glass. "You have given me everything, Rebecca. A home, a purpose, a future worth fighting for, and now this." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite the hardships of frontier life. Rebecca continued to work until the last few weeks, and the women of Fort Bowie, many of whom had warmed to her considerably, rallied around her with advice and support. Even Mrs. Murphy, the boarding house owner, stopped by regularly to check on her. Samuel Vance was delighted at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. He had sold his small ranch and moved to a room above the mercantile in town, making it easier to visit his daughter frequently. He and Elijah had developed a warm relationship, bonded by their shared love of Rebecca and their mutual determination to build better futures. In February of 1879, during one of Arizona's rare cold snaps, Rebecca went into labor. Elijah was at the mine, and Mrs. Chen sent her husband running to fetch him while she stayed with Rebecca, helping her through the early contractions. Elijah arrived in record time, his face pale with worry. He stayed by Rebecca's side through the long hours of labor, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement and love. Rebecca had never loved him more than in those moments when she was at her most vulnerable and he was at his most devoted. Their son was born just before dawn, a healthy baby with a lusty cry and a full head of dark hair like his father. Elijah cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and when the midwife placed the baby in Rebecca's arms, they both wept with joy. "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked, gazing down at the tiny, perfect face of their son. "Samuel Elijah Barnes," Elijah said without hesitation. "After your father and, well, me, I suppose." Rebecca smiled. "Samuel Elijah Barnes, it is perfect." The arrival of little Samuel brought new joy and new challenges. Money was tight, and Elijah started taking on extra work wherever he could find it, sometimes working from dawn until well after dark. Rebecca worried about him, about the toll the constant labor was taking, but Elijah was driven by his dream of their ranch. "Just a little longer," he would say, kissing her forehead as he headed out for another long day. "We are so close, Rebecca. Another 6 months and we will have enough for a down payment on that land near the foothills." Rebecca believed him because she had to, because the alternative was despair. But she also saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the new lines appearing on his face, and she worried. When Samuel was 6 months old, 2 things happened that changed everything. First, the Copper Ridge mine hit a new vein of copper, a rich strike that promised years of profitable operation. Elijah, who had been working there since his arrival, was promoted to assistant foreman with a significant raise in pay. Second, Martin Sutherland got married. His bride was a woman from Tucson, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, a cold beauty who seemed perfectly suited to be the mistress of his grand ranch. The wedding was an elaborate affair that half the territory attended, and Martin made sure everyone knew he was perfectly happy with his choice. Rebecca heard about it from Mrs. Chen and felt nothing but relief. With Martin settled and focused on his new wife, perhaps he would finally let go of his grudge against her and Elijah. And surprisingly, that seemed to be exactly what happened. The harassment stopped. Samuel Vance found his business dealings flowing smoothly again. Elijah stopped hearing snide comments from Martin's employees when he went to town. It was as though Martin had decided that his happiness was revenge enough. Rebecca did not care about his motives. She was just grateful for the peace. With Elijah's promotion and the cessation of Martin's interference, their savings grew more rapidly. By Samuel's first birthday, they had enough for a down payment on a small piece of land, 40 acres in the foothills with a spring and good grazing. It was not much, but it was theirs. They moved in spring of 1880 to a small existing cabin on the property that needed work, but was structurally sound. Elijah continued to work at the mine while beginning to build their dream, one fence post at a time. Rebecca threw herself into making their cabin into a home, planting a garden, raising chickens, and caring for their growing son. Their first horse was a gift from Daniel Barnes, a young mare with good bloodlines that Daniel had won in a card game. Elijah gentled her with the patience and skill his grandfather had taught him, and within a year they had their first foal. Life was hard but good. Rebecca would stand on their porch in the evenings, watching Elijah work with the horses while Samuel played in the dust at her feet, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this simple, hard-working, beautiful life, was worth every moment of uncertainty and fear it had cost her. Years passed. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father did. Rebecca gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah after Rebecca's mother, and another son they called Daniel after Elijah's brother. The horse ranch grew slowly but steadily. Elijah's reputation as a trainer spread throughout the territory, and people came from as far as Tucson to buy his stock. After 5 years, he was able to quit the mine and devote himself full-time to the ranch. The relief Rebecca felt when he no longer had to descend into those dangerous depths every day was immense. By 1885, the Barnes Ranch was established and prosperous, not wealthy by Martin Sutherland's standards, but successful enough to provide a comfortable life for their growing family. They had expanded the original cabin into a proper house, added a large barn, and acquired more land. Their horses were known throughout Arizona territory for their quality and temperament. Rebecca was 30 years old now, and Elijah was 34. They had been married for 7 years, and Rebecca could honestly say she loved him more with each passing day. He was an excellent father, a devoted husband, and a true partner in every sense of the word. They made decisions together, worked side by side, and faced every challenge as a team. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard, Elijah took Rebecca's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "Regret what? Choosing me, giving up the life you could have had with Martin." Rebecca squeezed his hand, understanding the vulnerability behind the question. "Elijah Barnes, listen to me. That life would have been a beautiful prison. This life, our life, is everything I could ever want. You gave me the courage to choose myself, to choose love over security, passion over comfort. I have never regretted it, not for a single moment. Even when things are hard, even when you are tired from working all day and the children are sick and money is tight. Especially then," Rebecca said firmly. "Because even in our hardest moments, I look at you and I see the man I love, the man I chose, the man who chose me right back. Do you regret it? Marrying a woman who brought you nothing but trouble and a vindictive enemy?" Elijah pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Trouble? You brought me everything, Rebecca. Purpose, joy, a family, a reason to build something that will last. Martin Sutherland could not touch what we have, not with all his money and power. We have something real, something we built with our own hands and our own hearts." As if to punctuate his words, young Samuel came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. At 6 years old, he was the spitting image of his father, all dark hair and brown eyes and boundless energy. "Papa, the new colt is standing. Come see, come see." Elijah laughed and stood, pulling Rebecca up with him. All right, let us go see this miraculous colt." They walked to the barn as a family, Sarah riding on Elijah's shoulders and little Daniel toddling along holding Rebecca's hand. The new foal was indeed standing on wobbly legs, nuzzling its mother, and the children watched in delighted wonder. Rebecca leaned against the stall door, watching her husband explain the birthing process to their oldest son with patience and love, and felt her heart swell with happiness. This was what Martin could never understand, the joy that came from building something with your own hands, from loving someone with your whole heart, from choosing your own path even when it was the harder one. Fort Bowie had grown considerably over the years. What had been a rough frontier town was slowly becoming more civilized. A proper schoolhouse had been built, and Rebecca had enrolled Samuel there, determined that her children would have the education she and Elijah had missed. The church had expanded, and Reverend Walsh, now much older, had taken on a younger associate to help with his duties. Martin Sutherland was still a prominent figure in the community, but his relationship with Rebecca and Elijah had evolved into something resembling mutual indifference. They would nod politely if they passed on the street, but otherwise kept to their separate spheres. Rebecca had heard through the gossip network that his marriage was not a particularly happy one, but she felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only a distant sympathy for the woman who had made the choice Rebecca had avoided. In 1886, Rebecca gave birth to their fourth and final child, another daughter they named Elizabeth. Elijah joked that they were building their own ranch crew, but Rebecca could see the pride and love in his eyes every time he looked at their children. He was an involved father, teaching the boys to ride and work with horses, reading to the girls before bed, treating all of them with affection and respect. The summer of 1887 brought drought to Arizona, a brutal dry spell that tested every rancher in the territory. The Barnes family, like everyone else, struggled through it. Their spring ran lower than it ever had before, and they had to carefully ration water between the household and the horses. Elijah sold several animals to reduce the demand on their resources, a difficult decision that hurt his pride but was necessary for survival. Rebecca watched their savings dwindle as they bought feed to supplement the sparse grazing, watched Elijah work until he was exhausted trying to keep everything going, and never once thought about the easier life she had rejected. Instead, she worked beside him, finding ways to stretch every dollar, preserving every bit of food from their struggling garden, taking in extra sewing work to add coins to their depleted funds. One particularly difficult evening, after a long day of hauling water and tending to stressed animals, Elijah sat at their kitchen table with his head in his hands. "I am sorry, Rebecca," he said quietly. "I promised you I would build something, and now I am watching it fall apart." Rebecca knelt beside his chair, taking his face in her hands. "Elijah Barnes, you listen to me. This drought is not your fault, and we are not falling apart. We are surviving together. This ranch is still standing, our family is still healthy, and we still have each other. That is not failure. That is success. We might lose everything. Then we will start over," Rebecca said firmly. "I did not marry you for a ranch or horses or financial security. I married you because I love you, because you are a good man and a wonderful father and the person I want to stand beside through whatever life brings. Ranch or no ranch, we will be fine as long as we have each other." Elijah pulled her into his lap, holding her tight. "How did I get so lucky to find you? You rode into town at exactly the right moment," Rebecca said, smiling through her tears. "And you were brave enough to fight for what you wanted. They made it through the drought. It was not easy, and they had to make sacrifices. But when the rains finally came in the fall of 1887, the Barnes Ranch was still standing. They had fewer horses than before, smaller savings, and a lot of deferred maintenance to catch up on, but they had survived. The experience, harsh as it was, seemed to strengthen rather than weaken them. Rebecca and Elijah had faced one of the worst challenges frontier life could throw at them, and had come through it together. Their children, even young as they were, had learned valuable lessons about resilience and family. As the territory moved toward statehood, Fort Bowie continued to evolve. The Apache Wars that had defined much of Arizona's early history were winding down, and the region was slowly becoming safer and more settled. More families arrived, drawn by opportunities in mining, ranching, and farming. The Barnes Ranch, with its reputation for quality horses, became an established part of the community. In 1890, when Rebecca was 35 and Elijah was 39, they finally paid off the loan on their land. The ranch was theirs, free and clear, 120 acres after several expansions, with a comfortable house, a large barn, good corrals, and a breeding herd of quality horses. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them after the children were in bed, sitting on their porch with glasses of whiskey that Daniel had brought as a congratulatory gift. "We did it," Elijah said, staring out at the land that was finally, truly theirs. "We actually did it, Rebecca." "Did you doubt we would?" "There were moments," he admitted. "During the drought I had serious doubts, but you never wavered, you kept believing." "I believed in you," Rebecca said simply. "I still do." Elijah turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the love in his eyes, as strong as it had been the day they married, perhaps stronger for having been tested and proven true. "I love you, Rebecca Barnes. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. And you are mine, Elijah. Always." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars come out over their ranch. From inside the house, they could hear one of the children stirring, and Rebecca started to rise, but Elijah gently pulled her back. "Let me," he said. "You rest." Rebecca watched him go inside. This man who had ridden into Fort Bowie 12 years ago and changed her entire life. She thought about the girl she had been, standing outside the general store with her wedding fabric, resigned to a loveless marriage. She thought about the moment their eyes had met, the electricity that had passed between them, the choice she had made to follow her heart instead of her head. It had been the right choice. Despite the hardships, despite the struggles and sacrifices, despite every moment of fear and doubt, it had been absolutely the right choice. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a capable young man who shared his father's gift with horses. At 16, he was already handling much of the training work on the ranch. Sarah inherited her mother's organizational skills and helped manage the ranch's business affairs, keeping meticulous records and handling correspondence. Daniel showed promise as a veterinarian, fascinated by animal health and welfare. Elizabeth, the youngest, had a gift for breaking and gentling even the most stubborn horses. Rebecca and Elijah watched their children grow with pride and wonder. On Sundays, they would all attend church together, a prosperous, happy family that stood as a testament to the power of choosing love over convention. Sometimes, when Rebecca sang the hymns, she would remember that first Sunday when Elijah had appeared in the church doorway, and her heart would swell with gratitude for his courage and her own. In 1895, Samuel announced his engagement to a sweet girl from town, the daughter of the new school teacher. The wedding was held at the ranch, under the cottonwood trees that Elijah and Rebecca had planted when they first bought the land. Watching her son marry the woman he loved, Rebecca felt the circle of her life complete in a beautiful way. Elijah squeezed her hand during the ceremony, and she knew he was thinking the same thing. Their choice to follow their hearts had created not just their own happiness, but a legacy of love that would continue through their children. As the celebration went on into the evening, Rebecca found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching her family dance and laugh and celebrate. Elijah appeared at her side, slipping his arm around her waist. "Thinking deep thoughts, Mrs. Barnes. Just grateful thoughts," Rebecca said, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about the day you rode into Fort Bowie. How terrified I was of what I was feeling, how certain I was that it could not possibly work out. And now I know that the best decisions in life are often the scariest ones. Choosing you, breaking my engagement to Martin, building this life from nothing, it was all terrifying. But it was all worth it." Elijah turned her to face him, his brown eyes, now touched with silver at the temples, still holding that same intensity that had captured her heart so long ago. "You know what the best part is? We are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us, Years to watch our grandchildren grow, to expand the ranch, to grow old together. Promise me something, Elijah. Anything. Promise me that no matter how many years we have, you will never stop looking at me the way you did that first day in Fort Bowie. Like I am the most important person in your world. Elijah cupped her face gently, his work-roughened hands tender against her skin. Rebecca, my love, that is the easiest promise I will ever make. You are the most important person in my world. You always have been. From the moment I saw you standing outside that general store, you always will be, until my last breath and beyond. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held decades of love and partnership and devotion. Around them, their family celebrated, their children danced, and their future stretched out bright and full of promise. As the sun set on the Barnes Ranch that evening, painting the Arizona sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold, Rebecca thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. She thought about the choices that had led her here, the courage it had taken to choose her own happiness, the faith it had taken to believe in love. Martin Sutherland had been wrong about so many things. Elijah had given her everything that mattered, not wealth or status or social standing, but love, partnership, purpose, and joy. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and hard work in choosing what mattered most. Rebecca had no regrets. Looking at her husband, her children, her grandchild on the way, her thriving ranch, she had nothing but gratitude for the cowboy who had ridden past, and for the heart that had been brave enough to make a choice. The evening turned to night, and the celebration continued. But eventually, the guests departed, the children settled down, and Rebecca and Elijah found themselves alone on their porch once more, as they had been so many times over the years. "Another successful family gathering," Elijah said, settling into his favorite chair with a contented sigh. "Samuel and his bride looked so happy," Rebecca agreed, taking her own seat beside him. "It reminded me of our wedding day. Our wedding was considerably smaller and less fancy, but no less meaningful," Rebecca said firmly. "I would not change a single thing about our wedding, Elijah. It was perfect because it was ours, because we chose each other against all odds and all advice." Elijah reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their 17 years of marriage. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had married Martin?" "Not anymore," Rebecca said honestly. "I used to in the early days, especially during the hard times. But now, I cannot even imagine it. That person I would have become, she is like a stranger to me now. A sad stranger living a hollow life. Martin's wife left him, you know," Elijah said quietly. "I heard it from Daniel last week. She moved back to Tucson, took their children with her. Apparently the marriage was not a happy one." Rebecca felt a pang of sympathy. "I am sorry to hear that." "I do not wish Martin ill, Elijah. I hope he finds happiness eventually. You have too kind a heart, my love. The man made our early years considerably harder than they needed to be." "True," Rebecca acknowledged, "but in a way those challenges made us stronger. We proved to ourselves and to everyone else that what we had was real, was worth fighting for. If everything had been easy, maybe we would not appreciate what we have as much." Elijah considered this, then nodded. "You might be right. Though I still could have done without the drought of '87. Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across their quiet ranch. "Well, yes, I think we all could have done without that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. This land, once so harsh and unforgiving, had become home in the deepest sense. Every fence post, every building, every tree had a story attached to it, a memory of their life together. "Elijah, Yes, love. Thank you for being brave enough to speak to me that day at the cafe. Thank you for fighting for us. I do not think I have ever properly thanked you for that. Elijah turned to look at her, his expression tender in the starlight. Rebecca, you have thanked me every day of our marriage simply by being exactly who you are. By choosing me, by building this life with me, by loving me even when I was covered in mind dust and had nothing to offer but dreams and hard work. You gave me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed. We gave each other that, Rebecca corrected softly. That is what makes us work, Elijah. It was never one of us saving the other. It was both of us choosing to save ourselves by choosing each other. When did you get so wise? I have had 17 years of marriage to an amazing man to figure it out. They stayed on the porch until the night grew cool, talking about their children, their plans for the ranch, the future they would continue building together. When they finally went inside, they checked on their sleeping children as they always did, a habit from their earliest days of parenthood that they had never outgrown. In their bedroom, Rebecca stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the land they had built their life upon. Elijah came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "Just how lucky we are, how many people never find what we have." "I was thinking the same thing on our wedding day," Elijah admitted. "I remember watching you walk down that aisle and thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. That feeling has never gone away, Rebecca. If anything, it gets stronger every year." Rebecca turned in his arms, looking up at the face she knew as well as her own, the face that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "I love you, Elijah Barnes, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. And I love you, Rebecca Barnes, for the rest of my life and beyond." They came together in a kiss that held 17 years of partnership, passion, and devotion. The evening ended as so many of their evenings did, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the choice they had made and the life they had built. As Rebecca drifted off to sleep that night, her last thought was of that dusty afternoon in Fort Bowie, of a cowboy riding past, of a heart brave enough to make a choice. Everything she had now, everything she loved, had started with that single moment of courage. And she would not change it for the world. The years that followed brought the joys and sorrows that make up any full life. Rebecca and Elijah celebrated their 20th anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them, looking back on 2 decades of love and partnership. Their children continued to grow and build their own lives. Samuel and his wife presented them with their first grandchild, a beautiful baby girl they named Rebecca in honor of her grandmother. Holding her namesake for the first time, Rebecca was overwhelmed with emotion. This tiny person represented the future they had built, the legacy of their choice to follow their hearts. When she looked up and saw Elijah watching her with tears in his eyes, she knew he felt the same way. "Our granddaughter," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "The first of many, I hope," Rebecca replied, carefully cradling the precious bundle, and there were more grandchildren over the years. Sarah married a young lawyer from Tucson and gave them 2 more grandchildren. Daniel went to veterinary school in California and came back with a wife and eventually children of his own. Even young Elizabeth, who swore she would never marry because she loved horses too much to love a person, eventually fell for a traveling horse trader and settled down to raise a family while continuing to work with the animals she loved. The Barnes Ranch continued to prosper, its reputation spreading beyond Arizona territory. When Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, the Barnes family was well established as one of the founding families of Fort Bowie, respected for their integrity, their quality stock, and their contributions to the community. Elijah's hair turned silver, and Rebecca's auburn locks faded to a soft gray, but the love between them never dimmed. They worked side by side well into their 60s, slowing down only reluctantly as their bodies insisted on acknowledging the passage of time. On their 30th anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a surprise celebration at the ranch. It seemed like half of Fort Bowie turned out for the party, a testament to how far the once scandalous couple had come in the community's estimation. Even Reverend Walsh, now retired but still sharp as ever, attended and gave a short speech about the enduring power of love chosen freely. Rebecca stood with Elijah's arm around her waist, looking at the gathering of family and friends, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this beautiful, full, meaningful life, had all started with a choice. One brave choice to follow her heart instead of convention. "Happy anniversary, my love," Elijah whispered in her ear. "Happy anniversary, Elijah. Thank you for 30 years of happiness." 30 years down, 30 more to go, he said with a grin. "Promise?" "I promise to love you for as long as I draw breath, Rebecca Barnes. That is a promise I can keep." And he did. They had their trials, their health scares, their sorrows. They buried Daniel Barnes, Elijah's brother and dear friend, in 1910. They weathered Rebecca's serious illness in 1914 that had them all frightened for months. They faced the challenges of aging, of watching their children struggle with their own difficulties, of losing friends and contemporaries. But through it all, they had each other. Every morning, Elijah would kiss Rebecca and tell her he loved her. Every evening, they would sit on their porch and talk about their day, sharing the small moments that made up a life. On Sundays, they would attend church, sitting in the same pew they had occupied for decades, and Rebecca would sometimes catch Elijah's eye during a hymn and remember that first Sunday when their eyes had met across the small sanctuary. In 1920, Rebecca and Elijah celebrated their 40th anniversary. The party was smaller this time, more intimate, just family and close friends. They were both in their 60s now, Elijah at 69 and Rebecca at 65. And while they were still active and engaged with life, they had stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, leaving that to Samuel and his sons. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Rebecca and Elijah sat on their porch as they had thousands of times before. The view had not changed much over the years, the same mountains in the distance, the same desert stretching out before them, but everything else had been transformed. 40 years, Rebecca said wonderingly. "It seems like yesterday that you rode into Fort Bowie and turned my whole world upside down." "I think it was you who turned my world upside down," Elijah countered with a smile. "I was just a wandering miner looking for work. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something that would last. We built it together," Rebecca insisted, as she always did. "Yes, we did." Elijah took her hand, his grip not as strong as it once was but still steady, still sure. "And I would not change a single thing about our life together, Rebecca. Not one moment, not one choice, not one challenge. Not even the drought of 87, Rebecca teased gently. "Not even that," Elijah said seriously. "Because that taught us what we were made of, proved that we could survive anything as long as we had each other. Every challenge we faced made us stronger, made our love deeper." Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the man who had been her partner for 40 years. "I was so scared that day I broke my engagement to Martin. I had no idea if what I felt for you was real or just infatuation. I was risking everything on a feeling. And it was the best risk I ever took, the best decision I ever made. You were worth it, Elijah. You were worth all of it." So were you, my love. So were you. They sat together as the stars came out, comfortable in the silence that only comes from decades of companionship. Inside the house, they could hear their great-grandchildren playing, the next generation of Barnes children who would carry on the legacy they had built. Rebecca thought about that terrified young woman standing outside the general store in Fort Bowie in 1878, trapped in an engagement she did not want, resigned to a life without love. She thought about the courage it had taken to choose differently, to follow her heart instead of her head, to believe that love was worth the risk. And she thought about this moment, sitting on a porch with the love of her life, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, and knew with absolute certainty that it had all been worth it. Every moment of fear, every challenge, every sacrifice had led to this, to a life full of love and meaning and joy. She had chosen her cowboy, and he had chosen her right back, and together they had created something beautiful and lasting. As the night deepened and the desert air cooled, Elijah helped Rebecca to her feet. They walked inside together, hand in hand, just as they had walked through life for 40 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to share. But tonight, they would rest in the peace that comes from a life well lived and love well chosen. "I love you, Rebecca Barnes," Elijah said as they prepared for bed, the same words he had spoken thousands of times before. "And I love you, Elijah Barnes," Rebecca replied, the same response she had given for 40 years and would continue to give for as many years as they were granted. They fell asleep in each other's arms, these two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would endure beyond their own lifetimes. Outside, the Arizona stars shone down on the Barnes ranch, on the home they had built, on the legacy they would leave behind. And somewhere in Fort Bowie, the town that had witnessed their beginning, life went on as it always had, full of people making choices, taking risks, following their hearts or ignoring them. But none of those stories would ever quite match the tale of the woman who was engaged to another man, and the cowboy who rode past, and the heart brave enough to make a choice that changed everything. It was a story that would be told and retold through generations of the Barnes family, a reminder that love chosen freely is the most powerful force in the world, that courage is rewarded, and that following your heart, even when it is terrifying, can lead to a life beyond your wildest dreams. Rebecca and Elijah Barnes lived that truth every single day of their long, happy marriage. And when their time finally came, years later, they left behind not just a prosperous ranch or a large family, but a legacy of love that would inspire generations to come. They had proven that sometimes the best thing you can do is follow your heart when it whispers, even if the whole world is shouting something different. They had shown that true love exists, that it is worth fighting for, and that it can sustain you through anything life throws your way. Their story began with a glance, a spark, a moment of recognition between two souls who were meant to find each other. It continued through years of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, always grounded in the choice they had made to love each other completely and without reservation. And it ended, as all great love stories do, not with an ending at all, but with a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, in the children and grandchildren who carried their love forward, in the ranch that bore their name, and in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and believed in the power of love to change everything. The cowboy had ridden past, and her heart had made a choice. And that choice had created a love that would last forever.